What is up, Janksters? It's your boy Graham, also known as HamHawks42 on the internet, and today I want to talk about a card that I have seen a lot of people prioritize in their standard brews, or even in older brews like Explorer and Historic, and I think more often than not, it is not correct. And that card is Tamio's Safekeeping. And I want to talk about why it's not correct and really break it down. So if you're not familiar with the card, it's an instant for a single green. Target permanent you control gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. You gain 2 life. So for what it does it very well. If the opponent is trying to remove something, pretty much anything, with any kind of targeted removal spell, you get the hexproof. Rad. If they're trying to destroy something or deal damage to it through combat or through, any kind of mass burn spell, you're burning down the houses and whatnot, Tamio Safekeeping protects it. Dope. This is all good, right? Sure. The reason that I'm saying it shouldn't be a top choice in many brews is because if you are using this card, it doesn't only cost you 1 green mana. It costs you 1 green mana and a card. That is the biggest cost of this card. So if you have something on the battlefield that you need to protect, this card is great. However, if you don't, this card does nothing other than gain you 2 life. That's it. And so as a result, I think a lot of people prioritize this card specifically in creature-based decks where they know they're going to have cutdowns and go for the throats coming for them, and they need to keep those creatures alive. Well, the problem is, in those creature-based decks, if you're being aggressive, especially in like a Monog Green kind of shell, and what I'm going to illustrate here is why Monog Green is not great in Standard right now. If you're curving out, if you're playing a Bloated Contaminator on 3, or the Kodama, the West Tree, right on 3, right where you want to be, or Pulukronos, the new Pulukronos, if you're dropping them right on turn 3, or even on turn 2, depending on, well, turn 2 is a little tricky these days, but you could be dropping 4 drops on turn 3 as well with some ramp. You get what I'm saying. Anyway, if you're playing on curve, you don't have the mana up to hit this thing anyway. And your opponents go for the throats or cut downs or Fateful Absences or Sheoldred's Edicts are going to be hitting you regardless. Additionally, Tamio Safekeeping does nothing against Sheoldred's Edict. Sheoldred's Edict targets the player, not the creature. And it forces a sacrifice. Players are allowed to sacrifice indestructible creatures, and as a result, Tamio Safekeeping does bubkiss. Additionally, against sweepers like Sunfall, those exile. Indestructible doesn't help at all, nor does Hexproof. So against a lot of the removal that's out there, Tamio Safekeeping doesn't do a lot anyway. And in the scenarios where it does, you're going to be spending mana and going down cards just to try to maintain board position. Meanwhile, your opponent is using a single card to try to remove something. Sure, you can effectively counter that removal spell with Tamio Safekeeping a non-zero, amount of the time. However, wouldn't you be better off if you could simply replace the creature on board with another creature? And I'm sure what you're thinking is, yeah, but my deck has a ton of creatures in it. Well, if your deck has Tamio Safekeeping, you have drawn a card in that game that was not a creature. You drew Tamio Safekeeping instead. If you had a higher density of creatures, you wouldn't be as worried about protecting the ones you have. And so ultimately, Tamio Safekeeping represents card disadvantage. What you're doing, you're going down a card to prevent your opponent's removal spell from hitting their intended target. In decks where you are doing combos, where you need to keep one specific permanent online at a very specific time in order to do the thing, these kind of effects are very, very good. If you're trying to just have decent value, you can do better. This is going to be there will be better cards in your deck. I guarantee it. And the reason that I'm calling this out today is because on my stream, twitch.tv/hamhawks42, I do an event every Tuesday called Tuesday Brews Day, where I play viewer-submitted decks. We have an application that handles the submissions and the priorities and all that jazz. It's a whole thing. But as a result, I play a lot of decks that the community has created. And I find it interesting, and I kind of see trends over time as to what is prioritized and what is valued. And I played a deck today that literally had 4 Tamio Safekeepings in it. And it didn't have any life gain synergies, and the creatures were like good value creatures, so sure, you want to keep them around, but I could think of a ton of other creatures that I would rather have in that deck instead. So I don't mean to call anybody out, and the purpose of this video is simply to point out, guys, the cost of running this is much higher than you might think because it costs you a card. Now let's take a look at some other protection spells from Magic's history, some of which are still legal in Standard, and see what is it about them that makes them good. So Tamio Safekeeping, you give something indestructible and hexproof, and you even gain some life on top. That is, that's a good effect. But when you compare it to cards like, say, Heroic Intervention, this card gives all of your permanents hexproof and indestructible. We're comparing apples and oranges here a little bit, because obviously we don't have anything on par with Heroic Intervention in Standard right now. We just don't. But we have in the past, and man, it was awesome. So for 2 mana, giving this to absolutely everything you have, that all of a sudden counters more. That's the other thing you got to be thinking about. These protection spells are green counter spells that only hit removal. And so being able to hit more types of removal is great. So with Heroic Intervention, this hits all of your permanents. That's also your lands and whatnot. It also prevents sweepers that are destroy based or damage based. So if your opponent hits a Blasphemous Act or your opponent hits a Wrath of God, you can Heroic Intervention in response. Their stuff gets blown up and yours does not. That interaction is so strong, you could even build it in your own deck. Like if you're running Selesnya, you could have a couple of emergency board wipes and make sure they're destroy based board wipes. They're your Wrath of Gods, your Day of Judgments. And then also include cards like Heroic Intervention. Or Teferi's Protection is another good one if you're in those color combinations. And then all of a sudden, those board wipes that you're running they're already a good inclusion in the deck just in case the game is not going your way. You don't want a ton of them, obviously, because again, you want threats in your deck that you're drawing into to progress your game plan. And a board sweeper may not help in that moment. But you got to be ready for anything. Well, if you're running these kind of universal protections, what's happening is you're protecting potentially 4, 5, 6 creatures online, or however many based on how big and silly your board state is, instead of just one. So Tamio Safekeeping, you're saving 1 card on the board for 1 card in your hand. With Heroic Intervention, you could completely stymie a board wipe. And if you have to spend it on, to counter 1 piece of targeted removal, depending on the situation on the board, that could still win you the game, and you spend only 2 mana and a card. So Tamio Safekeeping, it only costs 1, which is a significant difference, to be fair, but the other side of it is it gives you a life. So I'm comparing a common to a rare. It's not a fair comparison at all, but I want to point out why Heroic Intervention is so much better. Another good example of a card that has seen more play recently in Standard, at least I've seen it in more decks, over Tamio Safekeeping, is Royal Treatment. So Royal Treatment is an instant for 1 where a target creature you control gets hexproof, and then it also gets a roll. It gets the Royal roll. And that gives it a stat boost in addition to an ongoing ward. And so what you're doing there is you're protecting it for the turn, you're countering that targeted removal spell that was going after it, but now you're also giving it a stat boost and a perpetual ward. So it's keeping something that can help protect it in some cases, or at least a little. It taxes your opponent if they try to remove it again. And on top of that, you're still countering the immediate threat, assuming it's targeted removal. Now, one of the big differences, obviously with Royal Treatment, you don't gain life, but you do gain, and also it doesn't get indestructible, but you gain stats. The +1/+1 on the roll is a big deal, like a big deal. And as a result, Royal Treatment can be used as a kind of a weak combat trick to push in an additional point of damage on an untapped creature, or it can be dropped on a blocked creature to win the combat. Like if we have 2/3/3s and they're squaring off, or maybe my thing has first strike, but doesn't quite match your toughness, whatever the case may be. Royal Treatment can give you that extra boost of power and toughness that you might need to make what was a very good block for your opponent all of a sudden a very bad one. That's a significant value add, and it is big time. We've also seen that with cards like Snakeskin Veil. Like it adds a +1/+1 counter to the creature. Royal Treatment is very similar to that. Very similar. And then the other one that I want to talk about is Tyar Stand. This one takes the idea of adding stats on top of the protection to the next level. So Tyar Stand, the base on Tyar Stand is indestructible and hexproof for 1 green. You have the opportunity to pay 0 on X, and for 1, you give a creature indestructible and hexproof. So it's only a creature, it's not any permanent like Tamio Safekeeping, so that's a factor as well. But let's be honest, in a lot of these green-based decks, it's going to be a creature that you're targeting anyway. So all of a sudden, having the opportunity to pump extra mana into it to give a stat boost at instant speed, again, you're going to be winning combats in a way that you didn't before, and being able and pushing through damage. In an aggressive deck, if I have 3 attackers and you have 2 blockers, if I'm able to get to reduce your health total down, if we get to turns 4, 5, 6, and I have a bunch of mana open, potentially if I've been ramping, which green often does, I could be attacking, and then all of a sudden you might present your blocks and you might think you still have, okay, this will put me down to 4 and I'll be okay. Well, Tyar Stand X equals 4 on the one you didn't block. Just kidding, the game's over and I just won it. That is a level of utility that you do not see in Tamio Safekeeping. So when you're looking at these cards, you have to ask, okay, the ideal scenario is they've targeted me with removal, or targeted one of my permanents with removal. Can this help me? And I think in a lot of cases with the current state of things where they're targeting players and they're sweeping with exile and whatnot, a lot of these cards are genuinely useless as protection spells in many scenarios right now, which is really unfortunate. But you have Leyline Bindings, you have Go for the Throats, you have all that. Those are still out there and they're still going strong. And so yes, being able to stymie that is relevant, that is valuable, that is good, but does it merit a card in the deck? And I think in a lot of cases, no. The fact that some of these other cards give you additional bonuses, I think is huge, absolutely huge. I also want to point out cards with protection, or the cards that give protection, function very similarly. And the one that I wanted to use for this example, I suppose Skrelv the Defector Mite is probably a better example because it's in Standard. That one is also phenomenal because it's recursive and it's an infect creature. So that one is like quite good because you could save 3 or 4 things throughout the course of a game. With it. When in all likelihood, what actually ends up happening with Skrelv is you play it out early and the opponent kills it first. They spend a card to remove it because they know if they have any removal in their hand, they won't be able to hit anything else as long as it's live. And so they have to spend a card on it first. Well, and all of a sudden, you have traded your 1-drop for one of their removal spells. The floor on it it's just as good as Tamio Safekeeping. Anyway, but the other one I want to talk about is Shelter. If you're not familiar with this card, it is an instant for 1 and a white, where it gives target creature you control protection from the color of your choice. Now, protection is fantastic because it prevents damage from sources of that color. It prevents targeting. So if somebody targets it and you give it protection, that effect fizzles, similar to Hexproof. And, but it also prevents blocking. So if I'm going up against a Monog Green player and I have 1 large creature, I can cast Shelter on it, give it protection from green, and unless they have any colorless artifact creatures or anything like that lying around, I can swing in and it's unblockable. It just boom. So protection also adds evasion, which is very relevant, again, in these aggressive decks. But the other thing about Shelter is it has 3 beautiful words on it in draw a card. Shelter replacing itself puts it on another class that is significantly better than Royal Treatment or Tamio Safekeeping, in my opinion. Tyar Stand, there's certain decks where that will be better than Shelter, but the fact that it replaces itself in hand is massive. A card can give you a suboptimal version of an effect or a suboptimal permanent on the board if it draws you a card. It just does. You just can. And then with Shelter as well, if you have ways to copy spells or things like that, then all of a sudden you're drawing multiple cards and things get really silly. So I highly recommend checking it out because, frankly, it can become a card draw engine in the right setup as well as a protection spell. That's the big thing. If you take nothing else from this little discussion, this little rant of mine, all I ask is that when you're looking at protection spells for your deck, do they protect everything I have? And as a result, can turn the tide of a game in my favor? Or do they do something else that is good for my deck? Honestly, if you're doing like a Selesnya life gain deck with kind of the Ajani's Pridemate, Trelisara package, where you just have little things gaining life and you end up with a gigantic creature, Tamio Safekeeping might be a fine way, a fine include in those decks because you have a large thing that you need to protect and this spell gains you life. In that deck, gaining life is worth way more than it is in almost any other context. So in that situation, as like a 1, maybe a 2 of, sure, Tamio Safekeeping might not be bad, but don't jam 4 thinking, all right, nothing's going to get touched. Because in reality, with the way the game plays, there's a high likelihood that you're going to end the game with 2 Tamio Safekeepings in your hand and nothing on your board. And that sucks. Anyway, thank you so much for checking out this edition of the Overthinking MTG Podcast. I have a lot of thoughts when it comes to this game, and I'm going to be sharing them more and more moving forward. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, follow, hit the bell, whatever it is in whatever podcast app or over on YouTube, wherever it is you found this. Please engage. It would mean a lot. I really appreciate it. Also, feel free to leave a comment. So, thank you so much. I appreciate you. And I'll catch you on the next one.